Most gardeners think water scarcity is solved by better irrigation, and that belief quietly ruins their soil. They add drip lines, timers, and more frequent watering, but their beds still dry out, roots stay shallow, and crops crash the moment the system fails or restrictions tighten. Old farmers didn't solve drought by adding water. They solved it by changing how soil handled the water it already received. When you get this wrong, plants become dependent, not resilient. They grow fast when conditions are perfect and fall apart when they aren't. Old farmers couldn't afford that kind of fragility, and neither can you if you care about consistent harvests. If you want gardens that hold together under heat and mist watering, subscribe now. This channel is about growing food that actually survives real conditions, not ideal ones. The real trick was slowing water down underground, not chasing it from above. The oldest drought-prone farms didn't focus on surface watering at all. Instead, they focused on building a subsurface zone that trapped moisture and released it slowly to roots. Modern advice talks about mulch, but mulch alone only protects the surface. Old farmers, though, worked a water-holding layer into the soil itself. This wasn't compost-heavy soil, and it wasn't loose sand either. It was deliberately structured earth that resisted drying, resisted compaction, and stayed biologically active even when rain was, pretty scarce. When you water soil like this, moisture moves sideways and downward instead of just flashing off into the air. In my own beds, the difference showed up immediately. Where conventional beds needed water every 1 to 2 days in summer, beds built this way stretched to 4 or 5 days without stress. Leaves stayed firm, growth stayed steady. The soil below the surface stayed cool and damp. So they actually used carbon to store water, not just to feed their plants. The biggest misunderstanding today is treating carbon as just a fertilizer when really it's more like infrastructure. Old farmers would layer coarse, carbon-rich material directly into the root zone because, well, it acts like a sponge. Things like straw, leaf mold, chopped stalks, rotted hay, and even partially decomposed manure were all mixed shallowly into the soil. The goal wasn't nutrients, the goal was pore space. Carbon creates these tiny air pockets that, hold water through capillary action. When soil dries, those pockets release moisture slowly instead of dumping it all at once. In a small backyard garden, I've consistently used roughly 1 part shredded dry material to 2 parts existing soil by volume, worked into the top 5 or 6 inches. That ratio keeps nitrogen drawdown manageable while, honestly, dramatically improving water retention. Bare soil actually failed old farms faster than pests ever did. Old farmers learned pretty early on that exposed soil is honestly the fastest way to lose water. And not just right at the surface, moisture disappears from deeper down too. Sun and wind, they just pull that moisture upward, and as the soil dries out, the whole structure starts to collapse. Once that structure collapses, well, water just runs off instead of soaking in. Modern gardeners repeat this mistake every single spring by clearing beds completely and just leaving the soil bare until planting. Even just a few weeks of exposure can, undo months of biological work. Old systems always kept the soil covered year-round. If crops weren't growing, residue was. That residue wasn't just mulch on top, and over time, it was lightly incorporated, actually becoming part of the water-holding layer below. They planted in ways that protected moisture, rather than exposing it to the elements. Planting methods mattered just as much as soil composition. Old farmers didn't plant on flat, bare ground unless rainfall was really reliable. In dry regions, they would plant slightly below grade or into shallow basins that caught and concentrated water. I've tested this in raised beds by creating shallow depressions around plants instead of mounding soil up. That simple change reduced runoff and pushed water toward the root zone instead of away from it. It looks subtle, but the effect compounds. Every irrigation becomes more effective. Every rain soaks deeper. Why deep watering advice is often misunderstood. You've probably heard to water deeply and infrequently, but honestly, that advice is incomplete. Deep watering only works if the soil can actually hold water at depth. Without the right structure, deep watering just sends moisture past the root zone or right out the bottom of the bed. Old farmers built soil that accepted water slowly and held it evenly. When you water soil like that, roots follow moisture downward naturally. When you water compacted or sandy soil, roots stay shallow no matter how much water you apply. In my trials, deep watering only started working after rebuilding soil structure. Before that, it made almost no difference. So let's talk a bit about how this approach actually works in raised beds. You know, raised beds are kind of notorious for drying out, aren't they? The mistake a lot of folks make is filling them with these light, fluffy mixes that just drain way too fast. Old farmers would have considered that wasteful. In raised beds, I build a middle layer specifically for water retention. Beneath the planting surface, I mix in coarse carbon material and native soil, not just compost. This creates a moisture buffer that feeds plants during hot spells. The top few inches stay loose for planting. The layer below does the real work. What hydroponic growers can learn from this old trick. Hydroponics removes soil entirely, but water management is still the limiting factor. Systems fail when roots experience rapid swings in moisture and oxygen availability. The lesson from old farmers is buffering. So in hydro systems, it's really about using your media and managing your reservoir to slow down changes rather than, always chasing those perfect numbers. Honestly, roots just perform better when conditions shift gradually, not in sudden, sharp swings. Plants that come from soil built this way tend to adapt better to hydroponic systems, since their roots are already conditioned to steady moisture, rather than being in a state of constant saturation. Why did old farms survive droughts that honestly modern gardens just wouldn't? They weren't guessing. They were, observing cause and effect over decades. When a technique failed, well, it disappeared. What remained were systems that actually worked under pressure. They didn't rely on weekly watering schedules or perfect rainfall. Instead, they relied on soil that acted like a reservoir. That mindset is largely missing today, replaced by, tools and timers. Tools fail? Soil doesn't, if it's built correctly. So, here's how you can start using this trick without, having to rebuild everything from scratch. Just begin simple. You don't need to tear up your garden. Just start by adding carbon below the surface, not just on top. Work it in shallowly, keep your soil covered, and honestly, stop chasing constant moisture with all that frequent watering. Water less often, but, make each watering count by improving what happens after water hits the soil. The results aren't instant, but they're reliable. Each season gets easier. This is why water-smart gardens feel different. They don't panic under heat, leaves don't wilt at noon, growth doesn't stall the moment conditions slip. That's not luck, that's design. If this kind of practical, tested knowledge helps you grow better food with less water, go ahead and subscribe to the Farm Logic channel and, share this video with someone fighting dry soil every summer. The old farmers didn't waste water, and neither should we. Farm Logic.